Let's talk to Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent for The Times, because we've got plenty going on today, including Rishi Sunak pledging to cut the price of rail cards to pitch to veterans on the D-Day anniversary, of course. The Chancellor has announced the family home tax guarantee, and they're all still arguing about that £2,000 tax rise that Rishi Sunak claimed that Labour was going to increase everybody's tax by. Let's find out from Aubrey how it's going. Aubrey, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
So 4 weeks away from election day, how are you feeling so far? I mean, it's been a quite lively week, hasn't it?
It certainly has, and a few sort of lively weeks to start the campaign, really. Not least with Nigel Farage announcing that he's going to stand and sort of blowing the Conservatives out of the water and causing them all sorts of headaches.
Yes.
But in the aftermath of the TV debate, actually, the Conservatives are feeling slightly more upbeat, more so than they have in quite a long time. And that's because Rishi Sunak managed to repeatedly levy this attack on Keir Starmer, claiming that Labour's policies would force the party to put taxes up by £2,000 for every family. Now, Rishi Sunak made this claim many, many times. I think 12 times his ministers said yesterday, and it wasn't disputed. But then Keir Starmer managed to get into his stride a bit more, kill it off and say it was absolute garbage. The problem is it managed to get some traction, and we're now having this big row about the figure itself. Is it right? And it's all taking us back to that sort of big number emblazoned on the side of the Brexit bus back in 2016, which said £360 million fund the NHS. We're having a row about it, and Tory strategists are very, very pleased about that indeed.
Right, because of course there are all sorts of different theories going about abounding in the sort of Westminster bubble, aren't there? Including ones that say, oh, Keir Starmer didn't want to rubbish the claim too much because he actually wanted to be able to say that Keir Starmer's the man telling you the truth and Rishi Sunak's the one telling you a load of lies because it was all made up. When in fact it's not all made up, is it? Because the figure is okay. It's just a question of where it came from.
Well, I suppose the figure's okay if you accept all of the premises behind it. And what lots of ministers were doing yesterday was pointing to the fact that there was some Treasury analysis as the sort of source for this number, when in actual fact, Labour came out and revealed this letter from a senior Treasury official, which basically said this isn't a number that's based on Treasury analysis. This is based on assumptions by special advisors who are political appointees. I think at the end of the day, Labour is feeling slightly bruised because it has been sort of forced into a corner and spent a lot of yesterday having to fight off this accusation. There was a suggestion that maybe Keir Starmer was being clever by not basically getting down into the mud and arguing about this figure on TV with the Prime Minister. But if he'd been able to sort of pull that letter out of his back pocket in the middle of the debate and shut that argument down immediately, I think yesterday would have been a lot easier for the Labour Party.
Yes, I think so. And I think sometimes the spin doctors get themselves in a hell of a mess trying to spin things so far beyond kind of real, actual belief that anybody would have in anything really happening like that. I mean, they're just not that clever, are they? I mean, the idea of a sort of double bluff, which plays out all the way through a 48-hour news cycle, I just don't think they've got that kind of control over it.
I think that's probably true. And, again, we saw yesterday how much of a scramble they were left in. They were sending out fundraising emails basically saying we're having to spend campaign funds trying to spread the truth about Labour's plan on social media and distribute it through its sort of promotional marketing materials. So they've clearly had to invest a lot of time and energy in trying to, what they say is, correct the record. We saw, lots of ministers out yesterday going very, very hard, accusing Rishi Sunak of lying and breaking the ministerial code. So again, I think it's sort of double smart politics to think that people are sort of actually this was some big giant game and that they were waiting for an elephant trap, and they think that they were confident they got away with not falling into it.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, generally speaking, if you say to somebody, well, the Labour Party are accusing the Tories of being liars, or vice versa, everybody just sort of shrugs their shoulders and goes, well, they're politicians, aren't they? Of course, they're all liars. I mean, that's generally speaking what people will say. They're not going to go, oh my goodness me, what, a politician said something that wasn't true. I mean, it's just not going to cut through, is it?
There's a good question about how Labour have responded to this, because obviously that is the main line of attack they've sought to levy. Turn this back on Rishi Sunak and suggest that he's untrustworthy and that he's a liar. And Jonathan Ashworth yesterday was saying, well, Boris Johnson lied about parties in Downing Street during lockdown, so they're no better than each other. But again, does it really help Labour too much? I mean, it's sort of a helpful attack against the Conservatives, but at the end of the day, some people will just be left with the impression, as you were suggesting, that they expect this of politicians, and are all political parties as bad as each other? So it's not probably the most helpful sort of terrain to be having that argument on.
No, it puts them all down into the gutter, really, doesn't it? The Times this morning have got a front page on "We'll tackle murder law loopholes." This is Rishi Sunak vowing to make the biggest overhaul ever in history of homicide laws. He's going to make everything much tougher. Again, a lot of people saying, they're unveiling one policy after another on a practically daily basis. They can't surely keep this up, and both parties I'm talking about, really, for 4 weeks, can they?
Well, I think they're going to have to because there's lots of news-hungry journalists like me and my colleagues who are looking for what's going to be in the manifestos, and this is one of the more eye-catching ones. Not least because there are obviously some potential sort of bits to iron out here. We've heard so much in the last few months about the overcrowding of the prison population. We know that laws generally and sentences have gotten much tougher in recent years, and that's one of the reasons that there are so many more people behind bars these days. But how do you cope with that when the prison capacity is really straining at the seams? Obviously, Rishi Sunak wants to try and refocus his party so it regains that mantle for law and order, which the party used to be sort of known quite famously for, and these days is less traditionally respected for. So he's announcing this shake-up, which is leading to a review, which could pave the way to first and second degree murders, a system basically like in the US. Rishi Sunak is thought to have been taken particularly by the stabbing of 3 people in Nottingham. So he thinks that potentially those sentences were too lenient, and a review of the whole system might be a much more helpful way to look at this.
Yeah, interesting. Let's have a look at Keir Starmer, because both he and Rishi Sunak are actually over in France today for the D-Day commemorations. But here's what he had to say yesterday about this tax row that's going on.
We've been very clear throughout that all of our plans are fully costed and fully funded. And that means no tax rises for working people. And I'll spell that out. No income tax, no national insurance, no VAT. What you saw last night was a Prime Minister with his back against the wall, desperately trying to defend 14 years of failure, resorting, and it was a flash of his character, an insight into his character, to lies.
And there we are, you see. The thing about that is, he says no VAT rise, but of course there will be, according to the Labour Party, a VAT rise still on private schools, right?
Yes, that's true. I think he was probably sort of more talking in the round and no change to the headline rate of VAT. But yes, it's absolutely right. He is planning to impose VAT instead of making private schools, which can currently not have to pay for it, on those bodies. And we are hearing about private schools warning of an exodus of parents and pupils. Obviously, the question is really were they sort of terribly financially sustainable in the first place? And, is this ultimately going to be a good policy that puts money back into the exchequer that means that Labour can pay for things like, I think, breakfast school clubs in state schools and more nurses? So those are the questions. And so far, it doesn't seem to be having a detrimental effect on Labour's polling. They're still very far ahead.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the polls, isn't it? I mean, we don't know yet, I suppose, what the drag factor will be from the debate the other night. When would you expect to see that sort of affecting a poll, perhaps today?
Probably slightly close to the election. It's something that you probably would expect voters to gain an impression of through the multiple media appearances. I mean, Rishi Sunak is somebody who does get a lot of airtime because he's the Prime Minister. Naturally, so people sit up and pay attention to him a bit more. Keir Starmer is a much more unknown quantity. And so the 7 million or so people who are watching the ITV debate earlier this week will probably potentially tune back in for the BBC one, some of the leaders' interviews as well. So it's probably around those times when we'll start to see the polls shift, if they're going to at all. I think on Friday we've got the BBC is going to host its 7-way debate between some really fiery personalities. We're going to have Angela Rayner for Labour, Penny Mordaunt for the Conservatives, Nigel Farage. Those 3 are not going to be quite as tame, one suspects, as Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer were earlier this week.
No, indeed. I mean, the big poll story today is about reform, isn't it? It's a piece in the Telegraph, a YouGov survey saying that reform are now at 17%, just 2 points behind the Conservatives.
Absolutely. And I suppose Reform have been slightly struggling to understand whether or not they'd reached their ceiling. They were polling at sort of between 10, 13, 14% over the last few months. And so the question was, can that translate into any actual seats at Westminster? Because they fought a few by-elections and they didn't seem to be kind of outperforming in the places that they perhaps could or should be. And so there was this big question about whether or not this was basically the ceiling for them. And Nigel Farage has obviously swept in as leader again, and there is a real concern amongst senior Conservatives that that will significantly split the vote on the right of the party. There is obviously some suggestion that Reform voters potentially are former Labour voters as well, or Labour-minded.
Yeah.
For now, it seems that the vast majority of them are more likely to sort of be Conservative voters, at least in terms of 2019. But again, we're not likely to see any kind of repetition of 2019 where Reform stood down en masse for Conservative MPs. And instead, you've got this big split in the Conservative Party where even Tory MPs are saying, we wish we weren't standing against you. We wish there had been a deal so that we weren't at risk, because effectively we're on the same page as you.
Well, indeed, and particularly in the red wall, when you talk about who's going to be voting for reform, that could well be a lot of people who were actually Labour voters before 2019 and who then did vote for Boris Johnson because of Brexit and because of immigration and all the rest of it. So they could stay with reform rather than vote Conservative again.
That's absolutely right. Yes, they certainly could. I mean, I think, again, the wider context of this is there is a real concern that Reform are now only 2 points off the Conservatives. And I can't tell you how nervous Tory strategists are that there might one day during the campaign become a poll that puts Reform ahead of the Conservatives. That would really be quite catastrophic for the party. And obviously it would only be one poll, and the poll that matters is polling day, and people might be sort of thinking differently in the run-up to the election to how they'll actually vote in the privacy of the ballot box. But again, I think there's so much concern that there could be a repeat of the European elections in, I think it was 2017, where the Conservatives performed absolutely terribly. And Reform polling this well just shows further how much senior Conservatives are nervous about them sort of creeping up behind them.
And I've seen a lot of suggestions that could happen this weekend, that they could overtake them in the polls, but we shall see. Aubrey, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent there for The Times.